All right, we're going to start this week's COVID update a little differently than we usually do. We'll start globally and then work into the US instead of starting with the United States, because right now the global context is increasingly important to figure out what's going on, because globally cases are actually almost at a peak right now. We are almost at a pandemic high globally with about 675,000 cases per day, which is close to the absolute highest point we had, was about 745,000 cases per day. So thanks to just huge spikes in some countries and then small spikes in others, we are, of all of this time, going all the way back to whenever we're calling the beginning, February of 2020, or really even earlier, although we didn't know the number of cases at that time, we are essentially close to the global peak of cases right now. Now, it's important to understand that as more people get vaccinated, cases will mean less and less, in the sense that a COVID case will less and less likely be something that results in a hospitalization or results in a death as more and more people are vaccinated. But the important thing to understand is that globally, we are nowhere near that point in time. Right now, of the world's roughly 8 billion people, only 788 million doses have been administered. And since some of those, are two-shot regimens, under 1% of the global population has been vaccinated right now. So for now, a global case spike does mean more deaths eventually. The cases right now are highest in India, Turkey, here in the United States, in Brazil, in France, and Poland. Those are the top 6 right now. So with that as the global context, what's happening here in the United States? Well, let's now take a look. Cases in the United States, sort of level, slight uptick, bottomed out around 55,000 a day. Now back up to about 65,000 cases per day. So we are simply in a fight right now. It's variants and young people going crazy against vaccines. And we'll talk, by the way, in the next segment about what's going on with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is going to be paused at this point in time. We'll get to that. But you have places like Michigan and in the northeast of the United States with the more contagious British variant increasingly dominant, more and more young people getting the virus. And you've got that up against more and more vaccinations that fortunately are being done. The good news is that this entire time, deaths have continued to decline. When, 6 weeks ago, we saw the case decline level out, we said we might see deaths level out in 3 weeks as well. That hasn't happened. Deaths peaked in mid to late January, around 3,500 people dying per day. Just inconceivable tragedy. Now down to a still tragic, but about 80% lower, 750 deaths per day. That should continue to decline as vaccination is rolling out. We have not yet vaccinated enough people to see cases collapse. We are vaccinating enough older and at-risk folks that increasingly people getting the virus are less and less likely to die. And that's exactly why you start with the oldest and the most vulnerable. Some states, and this is good news, and then we'll get to what's going on with J&J in a moment. Some states are only about a month out from herd immunity. Massachusetts is a state, for example, where 92% of the population wants the vaccine. More than 1% of the population is being vaccinated daily, approaching high 30% vaccinated, and could be at 70% within 30 to 40 days. Now, for comparison, when Israel got to 50% vaccinated, cases just fell off a cliff, went down very, very quickly. So that could be coming in some states. In other states, like Mississippi, vaccination is happening really slowly. Not nearly as much interest in the vaccine. Many unscheduled, appointments in Mississippi that are just remaining unscheduled and available. So it remains to be seen what happens there. Now, as far as vaccination, we saw another single day record of 4.6 million doses on Saturday, nearly another 3.6 million doses on Sunday. These are really incredible numbers. So the playbook is keep vaccinating anyone at risk that you can convince as to the importance of getting vaccinated, that's great. And then don't go crazy just yet. We know that the Pfizer vaccine is less effective against the South African variant. The vaccines work well against the British variant, basically just as well, but it is more contagious. So that's quite literally a race. The path out is vaccination, likely boosters in the fall or winter, modified for the variants. That's where we are. So we have to keep going. At this point, most people I know personally have had at least one shot, even younger people. Full eligibility happening nationwide on April 19th. That's in 6 days. That's all great. The problem now is what's going on with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, so we should talk about that next. This is not good news, and it could slow down those really great vaccination numbers that I just told you about. U.S. regulators are now calling for a complete and total pause on using the Johnson & Johnson coronavirus vaccine because of 6 blood clot cases that have happened among 6 million people who have received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So the first piece is that the FDA and the CDC have already decided they will no longer use the vaccine at federal vaccination sites. They are urging states to also pause. And as far as I know, basically every state is doing it. I know people who were scheduled to get their J&J shot today, their appointment has been canceled. What we know so far, per the New York Times, is that 6 recipients in the U.S. developed a really rare disorder that involves blood clots within about 2 weeks of vaccination. It's 6 people, all women between the ages of 18 and 48. One woman died. A second woman in Nebraska has been hospitalized and is in critical condition. It's actually not 6, it's nearly 7 million people in the U.S. have received the J&J shot so far. 9 million more doses have been shipped to states, which presumably will just be held for the time being. Dr. Peter Marks, who directs the FDA's Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, put out a statement along with the principal deputy director of the CDC, Anne Schuchat, and they said, quote, "We are recommending a pause in the use of the vaccine out of an abundance of caution." So let's talk the numbers through. 6 incidents out of about 7 million vaccinations. The first question is, was this caused by the vaccine, or did these 6 individuals have some underlying disorder or abnormality that was exacerbated by the vaccine? Other questions that are being looked at include, given that we're talking about all 6 of the individuals were women age 18 to 48, could this be connected to some kind of medication? For example, and this is just an example, there's no evidence of this, but this is the type of question that's being asked. If all 6 of these women were on oral contraceptives, the birth control pill, that would be something to look at. We just don't know yet. And while it's being investigated, it's going to be a setback in the vaccination program. Everybody is being clear right now that there is not a causal relationship here, but it has to be investigated. In the U.S., somewhere between 300,000 and 600,000 people per year develop blood clots generally, but not this particular kind of blood clot. This is a cerebral venous sinus thrombosis. It's very, very rare, and we have to do it safely. That has to be priority number 1. We also have to make sure that this is reported on in a responsible way. You know, what's going to be on Fox News tonight? The anti-vaxxers are already saying, see, we were right about all of it. Well, no, the same people said mRNA vaccines are really, really dangerous. And it's been the 2 adenovirus vaccines that we are seeing this blood clot issue with. The J&J vaccine here in the US, AstraZeneca in Europe and in other places. Remember that out of 34 million people who received the AstraZeneca vaccine in Britain, as well as the EU and 3 other countries, there were 222 of these blood clot incidents linked with a low platelet level. So a slightly different situation. It's been the adenovirus vaccines where we've seen this, not the mRNA. And so when the same people that were talking about mRNA come forward and say all of these vaccines are unsafe, let's not allow them to gish gallop us. Let's talk now about the effect on just the vaccination program in the United States. With the J&J doses, we were expecting to have enough for all 260 million adults in the U.S. by the end of next month, by the end of May. Didn't mean everybody would have received their shots by then, but there would be enough supply. Without the Johnson & Johnson doses, most adults, there would be enough supply for 230 million adults. That's not everybody. That's not all 260 million. But so many people are refusing to get the vaccine that in practice, even without the J&J doses, there very well could still be enough doses for every adult who wants the vaccine to get one. And that supply would be available by the end of May. So we could be, depending on how many people want the vaccine, this could be a delay of a few weeks in getting to where we hope to get. It could be a delay of a couple of months. There are other countries that are so dependent on future doses of the J&J vaccine that if this doesn't get resolved in a way that it's deemed to be safe and the J&J vaccination continues, it could really be a disaster for the plans of some other countries. The vaccine might also come back online relatively quickly, but with some demographic restrictions. If we can determine that there's something about why it's only affected 6 women, do you say, well, we're bringing it back online, but only men should get the J&J vaccine? This is idle speculation, but these are the things medical regulators are going to be looking at. So not the news that we wanted. We continue vaccinating with the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. Deaths are continuing down. Cases are level. And if we can race the variants successfully, cases should be significantly lower in about a month. And we will continue following what happens with the J&J vaccine, as well as others, distribution, cases, variants, and all of that. Let me know your thoughts. If you've received the J&J vaccine already, but you're within the 2-week period during which these reactions are happening, are you worried? Or are the numbers so low that it doesn't concern you? Let me know. I'm on Twitter @DPakman. The number one funding source for the David Pakman Show has been and continues to be membership. And membership is not just a feel-good thing. You get access to the world-famous bonus show every single day just for members, as well as commercial-free audio and video feeds of the show day in and day out. You can sign up for membership very, very quickly at joinpakman.com. That's joinpakman.com. If the normal prices strike you as high, by all means, use the coupon code BETTER21, all one word, all lowercase. Become a member today. The David Pakman Show is a viewer and listener supported show. You can get lots of great extras and support the work that we do by grabbing a membership at joinpakman.com. We do have a coupon code available. That coupon code is BETTER21. And you can get the daily bonus show as well as commercial-free audio and video streams of the show. Joinpakman.com is the place. This next clip is sort of funny, but it's also kind of sad. I don't know why. I kind of got bummed out watching it. Dr. Anthony Fauci was on CNN yesterday with Wolf Blitzer, and Wolf Blitzer tried to make a baseball analogy to the pandemic. And the analogy was, Dr. Fauci, you like baseball, I like baseball. If this pandemic were a baseball game, what inning would we be in? And Dr. Fauci just seeming exhausted, saying, Wolf, this isn't like baseball. But I actually think there is a baseball analogy that could be made that Dr. Fauci could use in the future. I'll tell you in a second, but let's take a look at the clip.
Where are we, Dr. Fauci, as a country right now in our fight against this virus? We're both baseball fans, for example. What inning are we in?
It's not like baseball, Wolf, because the inning that we're in is going to depend on how we respond. And that's the issue, because, if I say we're in the 7th inning, it's almost over, and we have surges like we're seeing throughout Europe and the rest of the world, and the threat of a surge that we're seeing now, it's not measured in innings anymore. It's measured on what we do to contain this.
Okay, so Dr. Fauci is correct in the sense that we're only in the 7th inning if people behave one way, and otherwise it might really only be like the 4th inning or the 5th inning, and we'd have a long way to go. Here is me workshopping a better baseball analogy. Tell me what you think about this. Wolf, the pandemic isn't a game. It's really like a World Series where you have to win 4 games to actually win. So the question is, are we going to sweep this in 4, or is it going to go 7 because we don't finish off the virus as quickly as we could, right? That's the baseball analogy. What I can tell you, Wolf, is we have 1 more game to win, but will it be a sweep or will this go 7 games, right? You could even go further. Game 1, testing and controlling the spread. Game 2, scaling up testing and researching vaccines. Game 3, developing and testing the vaccines. Game 4, finishing vaccination to end the pandemic. And then next year, you might have another World Series, right? Variants, potentially new vaccines. The other baseball analogy I was thinking of that might work would be, listen, Wolf, we're in the 7th inning, but the virus is trying to catch up. And if they do, and we have a tie, then we go extra innings. And as you know, Wolf, extra innings can go on indefinitely until someone wins, and we don't want that. Every time a red state doesn't have enough people wanting the vaccine, the virus has just knocked in a single. If the virus gets enough of these singles, it's going to start putting runs up on the board. Am I going too far with this? Regardless, we all share Dr. Fauci's exhaustion with this. If it's game 4 and you can finish it off or have to play another game, you power through the exhaustion. And that's what we're hopefully doing with 3.5 million vaccinations a day. We're going to have to deal with the pause on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine over the blood clot fears, as I told you earlier. But big picture, I mean, like, do you think it's a problem that Wolf Blitzer and others use these, whether it's sports analogies or whatever the case may be? Like, on one hand, there really is no analogy to something with a defined duration because the duration is whatever we make it. New Zealand just stopped this. You could say they walked off the field after the first inning and said, we don't have to play the rest of the game because there's almost nothing left to do. They controlled it so well. I don't know. I don't know if maybe the sports analogies or the fight analogies that are sometimes used, maybe it makes it more relatable. Maybe it just makes it more confusing to people. Let me know what you think. Fox News host Tucker Carlson is again facing calls to resign, or for Fox News to fire him, and or for advertisers to boycott his program, after essentially arguing that the Great Replacement theory, sometimes known as the white replacement theory, is real in the United States, but it's not racist to suggest it. Now, it's very difficult to know where to start because there's so much here, but maybe to set the stage, I'll tell you a little bit about Great Replacement or white replacement theory. This is something that comes from France originally. In modern times, it's become a favorite of white nationalists and white supremacists. Originally, in France, it was a theory that white French people were being deliberately replaced by non-European people, including Arabs, South Asians, Africans, and others, through a combination of importing people from those countries through immigration, combined with white French people being encouraged to have fewer babies or having a lower birth rate. Now it's just become in the U.S., when we talk about Great Replacement theory or white replacement theory, it's a popular white nationalist, white supremacist idea. And it not only is it, generally speaking, white supremacist, it's also specifically anti-Semitic in some of its flavors. You might remember back in the Charlottesville white supremacist rally back in 2017, they were chanting, among other things, Jews will not replace us. That's what this is about. That's a reference to exactly this idea. So Tucker Carlson goes on, and he's interviewed, I think it's by Mark Stein, and says, Democrats do want to replace Americans, and they want to dilute the population, but it's not racist. It's just true. So let's just jump right into the first clip.
I'm laughing because this is one of about 10 stories that I know you've covered, where the government shows preference to people who have shown absolute contempt for our customs, our laws, our system itself, and they're being treated better than American citizens. Now, I know that the left and all the little gatekeepers on Twitter become literally hysterical if you use the term replacement, if you suggest that the Democratic Party is trying to replace the current electorate, the voters now casting ballots, with new people, more obedient voters from the third world. but they become hysterical because that's what's happening, actually. Let's just say it. That's true.
So Tucker, as a good faux populist, or maybe better said, as a right-wing populist, he knows enough to avoid saying this in the way that is overtly racist. He does it more subtly and with code. When he talks about replacing American voters with voters from the third world, he's talking about voters that are mostly brown people or black people. That's it. He's using coded language. So not only is this straight up great replacement stuff, it's also nonsense. And as I've said before, trying to win elections by importing people who are slightly more likely to vote for them in 7 to 9 years when they get citizenship, if they get citizenship, it's a terrible strategy. Think of the numbers. And this is why, we very often react to the rhetoric and we ignore the sort of factual or empirical basis. 75 million people voted for Donald Trump. If naturalized immigrants vote for Democrats 60-40, because remember, even though a lot of people like Tucker want you to believe that all immigrants are very left-wing, the truth is that Cubans and Venezuelans are not very left-wing. There are lots of Asian immigrants that are not left-wing. There are many Eastern European immigrants that are not left-wing. Anyway, let's imagine that naturalized immigrants by a 60-40 margin vote for Democrats. That means that for every 500,000 immigrants that become citizens, that's only a 100,000 vote margin for Democrats. When you compare that to population growth, when you compare that to people who move between states, it's a drop in the bucket when you talk about bringing people in, having them wait the 5 years before they can request citizenship, and then the additional period to go through that process. If this is how Democrats are trying to win, it's a very stupid strategy. Let's continue with the clip.
If this was happening in your house, if you were in 6th grade, for example, and without telling you, your parents adopted a bunch of new siblings and gave them brand new bikes and let them stay up later and help them with their homework and gave them twice the allowance that they gave you, you would say to your siblings, I think we're being replaced by kids that our parents love more. And it would be kind of hard to argue against you because look at the evidence. So this matters on a bunch of different levels, but on the most basic level, it's a voting rights question. In a democracy, one person equals one vote. If you change the population, you dilute the political power of the people who live there. So every time they import a new voter, I become disenfranchised as a current voter.
Now, by that logic, every time a new American-born kid turns 18, Tucker's vote is also worth slightly less. Every time an adult dies, Tucker's vote is worth slightly more. This is just life. This is inflows, outflows. It's not evidence of any kind of grand replacement theory. Let's look at just one more clip here.
So I don't understand why we don't understand this. I mean, everyone wants to make a racial issue out of it. Ooh, the white replacement theory. No. This is a voting rights question. I have less political power because they're importing a brand new electorate. Why should I sit back and take that? The power that I have as an American guaranteed at birth is one man, one vote, and they're diluting it. No, they're not allowed to do that. Why are we putting up with this?
So this is what happens when people fall for populism. In some ways, in rhetoric, people will watch Tucker and they'll say that there's a lot there that sounds kind of like Bernie Sanders. There's like similar language that's being used there. They're for the people. They're for the middle class. They criticize the elites, corporations. Sometimes I'm with the little guy. But then Tucker goes on a rant about third world immigrants diluting his voting power. Black Lives Matter is going to take your house. Immigrants make the country dirtier, as he said. I don't know if it was 6 months or a year ago. We covered it. This is the guy that some on the left are idolizing, saying Tucker is outflanking the left on some issues. There's a contingent on the left that has completely fallen for this guy. It's incredible stuff. And as consequences for Tucker, I imagine none. He's at Fox News to do this type of stuff. This is a feature, not a bug. And while he's dealt with some advertiser boycotts, anybody hoping for some kind of repercussions to this, do not hold your breath. We'll have more on this story and others from today's show on the David Pakman Show Instagram page. You can find us at David Pakman Show. And if you want to see a very strange hate mail that I got this morning Follow me on Instagram at david.pakman. The David Pakman Show is audience-supported media, and you can contribute any amount you want on Patreon, as little as $1 per month. Plus, you can get the daily bonus show, world famous at this point, and the daily commercial-free TV show by making those pledges at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. This is audience-supported media. We depend on the support of our viewers and listeners. Whether you listen to the podcast, watch on YouTube, or watch us on TV, or even listen on the radio, patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Mark Robert Rank, who is professor of social welfare at Washington University in St. Louis and also author of the book Poorly Understood, out now by Oxford University Press. So great to have you on today.
Oh, thanks, David. Great to be with you.
So, I mean, let's just jump into maybe what's one of the meatiest diving boards into this topic, maybe, which are the misunderstandings about the poor in the United States. Two of which, correct me if I'm wrong, are the misunderstanding that most poor people don't work, and the misunderstanding that most poor people are minorities, ethnically or racially. Tell us maybe how this came about, but also the truth of the statistics.
Yeah, I think, kind of underlying those myths is the idea that, or the myth that, poverty happens to somebody else. It doesn't happen to me. And so, it happens to folks who don't work or folks that are minorities. But, it doesn't really affect me. It's not going to happen to me. And what we show in the book is that actually, if you look at the majority of folks in poverty are actually white. A majority of more folks in poverty live in suburban areas than in central cities, and some of the deepest seated poverty is in rural America. And the idea that the poor don't work is simply wrong. Most of the poor have worked in the past and will work in the future. And it's really important to think about poverty as something that people go through. They're not poor their whole lives. They hit a spell where they have some tough times. They experience poverty. They may be out of work, but then they get back on their feet and they will work in the future. So, I think underlying those ideas is this myth that, poverty is something that happens to somebody else and doesn't happen to me.
There's a few different things I think would be interesting to explore. You mentioned suburban versus urban. How can we quantify and qualify the difference between the rural and suburban poverty versus the urban poverty, which maybe is more the caricature of where the myths come from?
Yeah, so if you, it's certainly the case that folks in, inner city, central city areas, the poverty rates are higher than the overall rate. But there's many more folks now that live outside of central cities. And so in terms of the number of folks in poverty, again, it's higher in surrounding urban areas as opposed to the central city. And as I mentioned, if you look at some of the most extreme poverty in the United States, it's actually found in rural America. So areas like Appalachia, the Deep South and Mississippi Delta, American Indian reservations, the Central Corridor of California, all of those areas have really, really deep-seated poverty. And that's kind of, when we have this image of who are the poor, we often think about the poor as, non-whites in inner city areas. And it's not to discount that poverty exists there, of course, but poverty is much, much wider. The way I like to describe it is that the reach of poverty is really wide, but its grip is not that strong. People move in and out of poverty a lot.
What are the most common reasons that people who at some point were not poor end up in poverty, which maybe is different from transgenerational poverty, where you're born into poverty and remain there? Is there an interesting distinction to be made there?
There is. So the folks that are long-term in poverty is about 10 to 15% of everybody who will experience poverty. So about 85% of people who experience poverty do so for a fairly short period of time. And by short, I mean a year or two. Now, why do they experience poverty? It's because things happen to people that they didn't anticipate, like losing a job, a family splitting up, getting sick, a pandemic occurring. All of these things have the potential to throw people into poverty for a fairly short period of time. Now, what's interesting about this is I've done a lot of work, and the book focuses on this right from the get-go, of the question of what's the long-term likelihood that an American at some point will experience poverty.
Right.
It turns out that between the ages of 20 and 75, 60% of Americans will experience 1 year below the official poverty line, and 3/4 will experience poverty or near poverty. And the reason is because, again, over a long period of time, things happen to people that can throw them into poverty. And when that happens, there's not a lot in place to protect them.
How much, or is that number at all skewed to people in their very early 20s in college who are technically in poverty, but it's not really reflective of their situation?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's a question that we often get on that research. And so what we did is we took out those folks and redid the analysis and found that it varied. It didn't change very much. I mean, the number of people that are actually in graduate school, that might sort of fit that sort of starving student picture, is actually pretty small, and so it doesn't really affect the numbers very much at all.
Graduate school and presumably college juniors and seniors, right? I mean, 2021.
Sure.
Yeah, it's not a huge. Doesn't change the numbers dramatically.
It doesn't change that. When you look over a 30 or 40 year period, it really doesn't change it very much.
When it comes to it may go back before this. Actually, maybe that's a good question. For me, some of the big historical markers of when the narrative around the poor started to resemble what it is now, I think back to the Reagan era, the story of, the welfare taking Cadillac queen having kids in order to get food stamps and money. How far back does that trope sort of go?
Well, I think you're right that kind of the modern version of that really started with Ronald Reagan. But the idea of the deserving and the undeserving poor actually goes back 400 years to sort of England's poor laws at the time. But certainly Ronald Reagan was the one in more modern times that really emphasized that. And the argument that he was making was using those stereotypes to argue for smaller government. His big line, one of his lines was, government is not the answer, government is the problem, that we fought a war on poverty and poverty won. Well, it turns out that well-constructed government programs actually have a very significant effect on reducing poverty. So take the war on poverty. In 1959, the poverty rate in the United States was around 22%. By 1973, it was 11%. We cut poverty in half because of the war on poverty and because of the strong economic growth during that time. So did we eliminate poverty? No, but it's an example that government actually can be quite effective in reducing poverty.
So in terms of reducing poverty, I mean, there are some poverty inducing factors that are similar around the world, and there are some that are less common. Medical expense bankruptcy doesn't exist in many countries. It does exist in the United States. So understanding that this may be hard to parse out when we talk about poverty, discussions often include all of the following and more: minimum wage, access to healthcare, improving education, cost of living, rising wage gap, on and on and on. What interventions have been shown to be the most effective at cutting poverty?
Well, I think the number one solution is jobs that can pay a decent wage, jobs that provide a livable wage, and also having benefits associated with those. So what has happened in the United States over the last 40 or 50 years is we've been producing more and more low-wage jobs and jobs that don't provide benefits. And so a median male worker who is full-time in the labor market today is earning slightly less, once you control for inflation, than he was earning in 1973. There's been a huge stagnation. And that's one of the reasons why more and more people are at risk of poverty, because they're working at jobs that just can't support a family. So I think that's the number one factor that we need to focus on. But as you point out, there are many other factors as well, such as, having access to health care, child care, good education. Those are all really key elements to addressing the issue of poverty.
When we think about stimulus like the kind we've seen now 3 times during the course of the pandemic, or a proposal for a $15 minimum wage, which the sort of more free market minded folks would say these are artificial decisions that are being imposed. The minimum wage would be a price floor on labor that might be above what the market would dictate, or just dumping a one-time payment on people is not really going to systemically change the value of their work to an employer, or whatever the case may be. What do we know about the longer-term impact of those types of interventions?
Yeah, interesting. So first of all, the idea of providing kind of a monthly universal payment to families with children has been going on in European countries for decades. And it's shown that that's really, really effective in terms of reducing the rate of childhood poverty. And in President Biden's pandemic package, we have a version of that where, every family with a child would get $300 or $400 a month. So we are actually starting to get some research in on the effect of this type of a policy. There was a study that just came out from Stockton, California, that did kind of a universal basic income, and they actually showed it had really positive effects. And interestingly, the folks that were getting the UBI actually had higher rates of employment than those who weren't, because that's one of the fears that, this creates a work disincentive. Actually, it creates a lot of positive incentives in terms of people, being able to live what I often refer to as a livable life.
The mobility question is an interesting one, where there's a bunch of ways to measure how likely it is that if born into poverty, one will exit poverty. And you can look at this at a country level. You can parse it out by education and race and all of these different things. For those who are born into poverty but get out of it, what do we know about the following generation, the kids of those folks, and their likelihood of remaining out of poverty as well?
Yeah, so the way I like to think about this is that it's the notion of cumulative inequality. So first of all, as I said, most folks who experience poverty do so fairly short periods of time, but they may not get that far above the poverty line.
Yeah.
But the way we often like to think about the United States is that there's a level playing field, and everybody's kind of starting at the same point. And I use the analogy in the book of actually what's going on is a modified game of Monopoly.
Oh, this is interesting. Now, I've used this, and I think I've used this analogy before, and I'm wondering where you first heard it, actually.
Well, I thought I came up with it, but
that's interesting. Wow.
But I don't know. Probably,
tell it to us, because let's see if it's the same one I use. Yeah.
Okay. So, we normally think of a game of Monopoly. We have 3 players. Everybody starts out with $1,500.
Yep.
They go around. The rules of the game apply. And, luck and chance and skill determine who's going to win the game. But now let's look at an altered game of Monopoly, where player 1 starts out with $5,000. Player 2 starts out with the $1,500, and player 3 starts out with $250. Now we're still going to have the same rules and abide by those, but who's going to win most of those games? Well, given the prior advantages, player 1 is going to win considerably more, even if he or she is not as lucky or as skilled.
Okay.
And the other point is that player 1 can play the game differently than player 3. They can take more chances. If player 3 makes one mistake, it's over. And that's what's really going on in this country, is we have an altered game of Monopoly where some players are starting out with that $5,000, more and more players are starting out with maybe 1,000 or 1,500, and unfortunately, many people are starting out with the $250. So we need to think about how can we address some of these prior advantages and disadvantages so that we have more of a sense of the quality of opportunity, which we often talk about as important in the United States.
Right. So we're at the end of our time, but my version of the analogy is,
yeah,
it's almost the same. It's everybody really does get the same amount of cash, but the late starting players have to contend with all the properties already having hotels on them.
absolutely.
And so but it's really the same idea. That's very interesting.
Yeah. No, that is.
We've been speaking with Mark Robert Rank, professor of social welfare at Washington University in St. Louis. The book is Poorly Understood, which we will link to in the YouTube video for our conversation today. Mark, really a pleasure having you on.
Oh, this was great, David. I really enjoyed it.
The David Pakman Show is now on Instagram at David Pakman Show. You can check out behind the scenes pictures, memes, shots of the studio, shots of what Pat does all day. Very, very concerning to a lot of people. All of that and more on the David Pakman Show Instagram account at David Pakman Show. So we're still in the process of learning about the police shooting that left Dante Wright dead in Brooklyn, Minnesota. Not Brooklyn, New York, Brooklyn, Minnesota. And yesterday, police had a press conference about it. One of the strangest police press conferences I've ever seen. In the middle of it, the Brooklyn police chief, Tim Gannon, just walked out. He later returned. There were questions as to why did he leave, and the answers were very strange. What we know is that police shot and killed a black man on Sunday during a stop for a traffic violation. There have been protests. There has been unrest. I've looked at the video of the shooting, which we will not be playing here, but you can find it online. We know that the officer announces that she will be tasing, but then she pulls out her gun and shoots the individual. Apparently, and this is the case that you will see made during this press conference, mistaking her gun for her taser, which is immediately raising questions about how could that be called an accident if you are a police officer. It's your sort of main thing to know. Do I have a taser in my hand or do I have a gun? Are these my handcuffs or is this a soda? But we're going to get to that. The man killed by police was identified by relatives and by Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as Dante Wright, 20 years of age. NBC reports that the state mobilized the National Guard when crowds gathered in front of the Brooklyn Center Police Department on Sunday evening. A curfew was ordered. It's been chaotic. Let's get into the clips. One of the strangest video police press conferences that I've ever seen. Here's the first part where Chief Tim Gannon says, listen, the officer announced a taser but drew her handgun. That sort of seems like the officer meant to tase Dante Wright, not shoot Dante Wright.
As you can hear, the officer, while struggling with Mr. Wright, shouts, taser, taser, several times. That is part of the officer's training prior to deploying a taser, which is a less lethal device. That is done to make her partners aware, as well as the subject, that a taser deployment will be imminent. During this encounter, however, the officer drew their handgun instead of their taser. For informational purposes, we train with our handguns on our dominant side and our taser on our weak side. So if you're right-handed, you carry your firearm on your right side and you carry your taser on the left. This is done purposefully and is trained. As I watch the video and listen to the officer's commands, it is my belief that the officer had the intention to deploy their taser, but instead shot Mr. Wright with a single bullet. This appears to me, from what I viewed and the officer's reaction and distress immediately after, that this was an accidental discharge that resulted in the tragic death of Mr. Wright.
So the officer yelled taser and was distressed. So therefore, it was an accident. And that's the statement from the police chief. Now, what the police chief calls an accident by the law could be manslaughter. And this has been ruled a homicide. Remember, homicide can be murder, but it can also be manslaughter. Brooklyn Center, Minnesota Police Chief Tim Gannon was asked, did you authorize the use of tear gas and rubber bullets during the protests? He essentially says yes.
Was it your decision to release tear gas and to shoot fire bullets, rubber bullets at the young protesters?
Sure. I'm the police chief in this city. Police action is made by me. The decision is made by me. Does that answer your question?
Then a reporter says, if the reason for the stop was not having a license plate or having an expired license plate, are you aware that there's currently a multi-month delay on license plates here? And the police chief just walks out of the press conference.
Significant delay. Are you aware that there's a significant delay in getting tabs and things of this nature from the DMV? So even people who have purchased tabs are unable to get them because there's a 2 to 3 month backlog. Are you aware of that? And is your staff also aware of that? And have you made any type of recommendations to your staff to be mindful that we're in the middle of a pandemic and don't pull people over for tabs, particularly because there is a significant delay in getting those tabs from the Department of Motor Vehicles? Are you aware of that?
I am aware of
Chief
that.
Police.
I am aware of that.
Is your staff aware of that?
Yes, they are. That was the last question. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Mayor, may I ask you, in that video, the female officer clearly made a fatal mistake.
So this was very abrupt, bizarre. He just walks off, and the Brooklyn city manager appears to be unable to explain why that happened.
Mr. Mayor, when I asked that question about the firing of the police officer, the police chief left.
Yeah.
What is that an indication of? Is he dealing with something perhaps more important, or is that some type of silent protest? Because he left immediately.
Immediately.
I can't speculate.
Mr. Mayor, you have a comment?
I do not know why the excuse me.
Does that bother you without knowing why that he just walked out?
I do not know why the chief left. I can only speculate as to why he left at the time that he did.
Does it bother you?
What would your speculation be?
I don't have any speculation. I mean, it's possible that the chief takes a position perhaps similar to the city manager, that there needs to be some kind of a process, or I don't know.
I can only speculate, and I believe from the amount of coffee I saw him chug, he needed to empty his bladder. Like, how odd is all of this stuff? Now, then here is where it gets even crazier. The police chief comes back. Did someone tell him off screen, that looked terrible, get back out there? So he's back, and then he says the officer needs due process.
Yes, sir.
Chief, may I ask you directly as I asked the mayor? Do you believe the officer who fired this fatal shot, and I understand there's due process, we get that, but ultimately she shot and killed a 20-year-old man. The mayor has indicated she should be terminated. What's your position on that?
My position is that officer afforded due process just like anybody else does. She has the right to be heard. She has the right to give her statement. She has the right to tell what she felt, what she thought. Not what I thought, not what I saw, but what she thought and and that may have an impact. She's on administrative time out. She will not be returning to duty until this investigation has run its course. And she, for all intents and purposes, I think we can look at the video and ascertain whether or not she'll be returning.
So can you tell us?
So everything the chief says there is correct. Of course, the officer does get due process. They should be on administrative leave, and they are. That's not the issue. The issue is more this guy's bizarre attitude, demeanor, walking out, walking back in. Now, I'm already getting a ton of emails from people saying, this officer is going down. This is clear manslaughter. They're going down for manslaughter. Others saying they're not getting anything here. I'm going to give you my both non-legal expert and cynical opinion about this case. I believe that this officer will not be found guilty of any criminal wrongdoing. I think that you will either see, as far as criminal goes, something settled, resolved, an agreement before this ever gets to trial, or if it goes to trial, you will see an acquittal, and you will see a civil settlement for big bucks with the family of Dante Wright. Why do I say this? There's no question that if you mean to tase someone and you pull out a gun and you kill them, that's manslaughter. colloquially speaking. But the way that police shootings are handled in the legal system, with the taser warning, they're already pulling the games of, well, this is someone who had a run in, he had I think it was a warrant for some minor drug related thing. They're going to pull out all the games that they normally do. I'm not giving you my moral opinion. I'm giving you simply my prediction. I think that we will see no guilty verdicts criminally for this officer, and likely a big financial settlement with the family. It's going to be a long time. It could be years before we ever get to that resolution. But that's my sense at this point in time. Tell me your thoughts. We now have new allegations against beleaguered Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz. We've already discussed his alleged involvement in child sex trafficking and or possibly paying minors for sex. There's a whole world of scandal for Matt Gaetz related to that. But now there's a totally new problem for him. He is suspected of being involved in a shill candidate scheme. Now, a shill candidate scheme or a ghost candidate scheme is one where if I'm running or if my friend is running, I might induce or help someone else run, not because I want them to win, but because I want them to siphon off votes from my opponent. And I'll explain exactly how it worked. In this case, in Florida's 37th and 39th districts, Alex Rodriguez and Celso Alfonso ran for office. One of the candidates has already been charged. The believed mastermind is a guy called Frank Artiles, a resigned Florida senator. And now we've learned of a third shill candidate named Justine Iannotti, who ran in the 9th district in Florida. All three of these candidates appear to be funded by the same dark money through a PAC called Our Florida PAC and a PAC called the Truth PAC for Central Florida. Both PACs are funded by a single untraceable Atlanta company called Proclivity that made only one expenditure to a printing company called Advance Impression. It's all weird. And the Matt Gaetz piece is that Gaetz appears to be connected to that Central Florida aspect of this. And the idea is that Justine Iannotti ran as an independent to help the Republican Jason Brodeur win by taking votes away as a left-leaning independent from the Democratic candidate Patricia Sigmund. Every aspect of this is imploding. Florida lobbyist Chris Dorworth, who is the person that talked to Matt Gaetz about the shill candidate, Justine Iannotti, resigned on Friday from his lobbying firm. Now, it's important to understand, it doesn't appear that the being involved with creating a shill candidate is illegal. The criminal part, and we're still learning, this is my best reading as of right now, the criminal part would be the dark money funding all of this. And it's basically just a spoiler scheme that appears to be legal as long as it's funded legally and transparently. And the idea is, if I'm a Republican and I'm running against a Democrat and it's expected to be tight, 50-50, it could come down to a half point. I go out and recruit a left-leaning independent to run so that they will siphon votes away from my opponent and I as the Republican win. That's the strategy. In a sense, this is what Trump was doing with the reports that people around Trump were advising and encouraging Kanye West to run. The belief being, if Kanye runs, it'll take votes away from Joe Biden and it'll be good for Donald Trump. It's a slimy practice. It's not a new one. It appears to be legal as long as you do it in the particular way where the funding is transparent. Democrats could do this. Democrats could do this by starting to register and help libertarian candidates run across the country. You might have a tight Senate race. Could be 51-49 for the Republican. You bring in some freedom, free market libertarian, and then if they take 3 points from your opponent, you win. That's the idea. Will Matt Gaetz ultimately get arrested for something? Or is he going to escape scot-free for everything he is suspected of? Let me know your thoughts. I have a voicemail today, which you can leave me anytime at 219-2DavidP. This is, again, we talked about enlightened right-wingers who believe that they are enlightened. Here's a right-winger who believes that he has a balanced view of the riots and of the election being stolen and all of this stuff. Let's take a listen. This is interesting.
You know what?
Oh, hold on.
Yeah, hi, this message is for David. I'm sitting here watching your show, Dave, and you're talking about, to this poor old lady, about her beliefs on whether the election was stolen or not.
Yeah.
Why don't you just be honest about it instead of being so patronizing towards people? You know, what we saw that night was water mains breaking in Georgia.
So the water main Georgia story has been cited often. There doesn't appear to be anything odd about it. And remember, the election didn't come down to Georgia, so you've got to take it piece by piece.
They had to stop counting. People were being kicked out.
So they had to stop counting. Different states have different rules about counting hours. They were predetermined. People being kicked out, people who had you can't just go and tour, like it's a local park, places where votes are being counted. There are actual observers, but the people that showed up in Michigan, they had no right to be there.
You know, as far as we knew, at 1:30, Trump was 80% to win.
That's not true. But more importantly, for months, we knew about the red mirage. Early votes in person would go Trump. Later votes would go. We knew that ahead of time. And then they act like it's some big shock when it happens.
You know, and everybody wakes up in the morning and sees it completely flipped.
So that's the story. This person believes they're a critical thinker, but that's just the story Trump told. And this guy fell for it.
3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning in the silence of the night. You know?
That's, again, the idea of massive dumps of ballots in the middle of the night.
And so, look, it's not that people are believing Donald Trump about anything.
Really? Because you seem to have basically repeated Trump's ideas verbatim in this voicemail.
We're believing our eyes. So.
Yeah. So anyway, that's a balanced, rational Trump supporter who just repeated all the same stuff Trump has been saying for 5 months at this point. We've got a great bonus show for you today. We will talk about the progressive movement demanding that Justice Breyer retire. We will talk about PragerU's latest target, kindergarten. And we will talk about New Zealand passing miscarriage bereavement leave law. Very interesting. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. Get instant access to the bonus show by becoming a member at joinpakman.com.